Ladies and gentlemen, the work of Marjan and the work of Valerie Steele, our special guest tonight, are linked in their shared broad interest in fashion, jewelry, and accessories as personal outings of taste and identity. Valerie is a historian, an author, and she is the director and head curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Being the author of over 25 publications and curator of more than 20 exhibitions, Valerie Steele has significantly contributed to the cultural status of fashion. She was described by the Washington Post as one of fashion's brainiest women, and by Susie Menkes as the Freud of fashion. It is my great pleasure to ask Valerie Steele to the stage.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today with you. Now, why do I begin a lecture on why fashion matters with a painting by Lucas Cranach of Venus, goddess of love and beauty? After all, she's naked, except for a transparent veil and a very stylish hat and necklace. Well, there are a few reasons for that. One, because all known societies wear some kind of decorative and symbolic dress, even if it's only body paint and beads. Two, I wanted to get you away from thinking just about fashion now. And as I was doing research for this paper, I discovered there was a book called Why Fashion Matters. And I went to the book and I read that fashion matters because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that employs more than 60 million people globally, and it's important to the economy, society, and the individual in that order. So I thought, well, okay, that would explain why fashion is capitalism's favorite child, but it might not explain why fashion matters to us. And also, I wanted to use this picture because of something that I think is a very important aspect of fashion and jewelry, which is that, like all forms of dress, fashion is worn on the human body. Fashion is an embodied experience, and it has to be considered in relation to the body that it decorates, covers, or uncovers. Furthermore, we're more than a body. We're a person with an identity, and so fashion also is connected with us as a person, as an individual human. So in thinking about why fashion matters, I've been inspired by the book Jewelry Matters, and as I put this together, I continue to refer back mentally to the idea of how jewelry would relate to what I'm saying about fashion. So, in order to understand why fashion matters, I guess it would help if we started with finding out what fashion is. Unfortunately, that's harder to do than it seems. Fashion is a relatively modern subcategory of dress. That seems to be the general assumption. Unlike another subcategory, jewelry, which seems to be a universal cultural phenomenon, fashion, it's been thought for a long time, is just part of certain cultures. That in Western Europe, it started sometime in the Middle Ages, and prior to that, there was something like more traditional dress. It's a little bit confusing because definitions of fashion have continued to change, but for the moment, let's just hold on to the idea that fashion, however it's defined, includes all kinds of decorative accessories, such as hats and jewelry, as well as clothing. And that basically anything that can be put on the body could be considered as a kind of dress. So things that you put on your body could be part of this family of dress. Now, in the course of this lecture, I've looked at a number of different disciplines relating to dressing the body. History, obviously, sociology, anthropology, of course, cultural studies, fashion studies, psychoanalysis. As I said, I'm keeping to try and look back at fashion and jewelry, which overlap in interesting ways. And I'm going to begin with some theories about the origin and significance of the human urge to decorate the human body. And then I'll briefly look at some of what fashion historians think is the symbolism and semiotics of dress in traditional societies. And then I'll investigate how modern fashion gradually came to replace traditional forms of dress, bearing in mind that modern and traditional are very relative terms. And finally, I'm going to be touching on some of the underlying motives for why we human beings wear clothing and adornment. So let's look at some of the theories. The biblical story of Adam and Eve argues that the origin of clothing was shame, and the purpose of clothing is modesty. So after they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together because they were ashamed. They made themselves apron. So according to St. Augustine, once they experienced lust, or at least Adam had, St. Augustine wasn't sure that Eve ever did, but once Adam had experienced lust, then they became ashamed of their previously innocent nakedness. So this lust-shame theory, also known as the modesty or decency theory of dress, has been accepted for centuries in the West and still has adherents. This is obviously not the only myth about the origin and purpose of dress. I was talking to some people at dinner saying I'd spent time in Bali, and in Bali the myth is that the gods gave humans the ability to weave cloth and make clothes so that they could appear more like the gods and less like animals. Now, by the later 19th century, educated people started to suggest that modesty, decoration, and protection were probably the three main purposes of clothing. Then ethnologists and anthropologists began to suggest that studies of primitive people indicated that, quote, ornament and clothing were in the first place intended not to conceal or even protect the body, but in large part to render it sexually attractive, to accentuate rather than to conceal, end quote. And it's certainly true that certain forms of raiment often concealed the genitals, whether it's a penis sheath in New Guinea or a cash sex in Cameroon, but they obviously also called attention to the genitals. So this still begs the question of why people wanted to cover that part of the body up, but that is one element that came into the thinking. And of course, it was something that cartoonists in the 19th century were extremely interested in, and they played with the ambivalent erotic symbolism of the fig leaf. Was it to conceal, although that's incredibly vulval-looking fig leaf over on that side, or was it really intended to draw attention to the sexuality? And the cartoonists suggested that particularly modern European fashion was actually intended to be highly sexual, at least when it came to women's fashion. Yet research in many disciplines, not least anthropology, has demonstrated that decoration is only partly about sexual attraction. So this picture of Dinka women in East Africa shows that this jewelry-like adornment conveyed all sorts of information about the individuals who wore it, relating to their social identity, gender, age, marital status, wealth, group affiliation. And as a matter of fact, another picture by the same photographer shows that the woman wearing the red necklace actually was wearing nothing from the waist down. So she had no cash sex. But here this was giving other forms of information about what I would call the social identity of the people wearing it. If you go through the history of dress, the idea that clothing is primarily functional has given way to an idea that in many, perhaps all cultures, the symbolism or the semiotics of dress is more important than protection per se. Indeed, even protection may be more psychological or magical than it is actually physical. For example, here in ancient Egypt, dress and adornment signified a number of important features of the wearer's lives and identities. Akhenaten, for example, wears a traditionally masculine garment, one, in fact, that was worn by all classes of Egyptian society, whereas Nefertiti wears a royal version of female dress, and both wear elite, probably royal headgear. Jewelry and other forms of ornament in ancient Egypt also had ritual, religious, and magical significance, just as they do in many civilizations today, including our own, where amulets and talismans continue to be worn as good luck charms for protection, for example, against the evil eye. Shakespeare once described fashion as a deformed thief who wears out more apparel than the man. And his reasoning was that fashion changed so rapidly that before you could wear it out, you had to switch to another style because it had changed already. And here we see in the wardrobe of Matthias Schwartz, which is recorded over the course of his life, he had a series of paintings done showing what his clothing looked like as he grew up and grew older. And this wonderful image, which is on the cover of the book, is from June 14th, 1524. And it shows him at age 27 in a bright green doublet and hose with a bright scarlet bonnet, a small heart-shaped purse, a coral bracelet, a brooch on his bonnet, carrying a sword, etc. So this now indicates we've moved from whatever traditional form of dress, sort of the long robes of the early Middle Ages, to something which is a much more rapidly moving form of fashion. And the fashion would continue to escalate. Here you have to emphasize that fashion is thought of in terms of changing styles of dress, not only about social identity, but also very much about a particular moment in time. And this is something very important. The whole relationship of fashion and time is crucial. Fashion is usually thought of in terms of the desire for something new, but why that desire should arise and what it involves is usually unclear. It's certainly clear as we look at this type of image that fashion is part of history. And the more we learn about fashion and history, the more it becomes clear that fashion is not just a whirligig of meaningless change, but that it is embedded in each historical period, and as it changes, it's in relation to changes in the society. And indeed, often that fashion itself will be the motor behind changes in the society. So the fashion system then seems to require a kind of social differentiation or a class society with the possibility for rising socially. In other words, the theory developed that fashion is or seems to be related to the development of proto-capitalist societies, or at least societies in which commerce was important, not necessarily industry, not modern capitalism. Traditionally, fashion has been thought of as a Western phenomenon, and yet scholars in recent years have demonstrated quite clearly that fashion in the sense of fairly regularly changing styles existed, at least to a degree, in a variety of other cultures. In Tang Dynasty China, later in Ming Dynasty China, studies have shown that fashion clearly existed, and people were complaining about it bitterly. In the Tang, conservative men were complaining, saying, our women are dressing like foreigners. And in the Ming Dynasty, it said fashionable young men in Suzhou would change their clothes all the time. Long before the silk had worn out, they'd change to something else. Some scholars go further and argue that fashion exists even in small-scale, fairly isolated societies. These hardly exist anymore in the world, so I think you could say that fashion has permeated the world. But clearly, if we go back in time, we can find it in ancient China, also in ancient Japan, right around this period, at the same time as the Tang, so 9th century, you find in Heian, Japan, fashion existing. And in fact, a very high term of praise in Heian, Japan was to call something imamakashi, up to date. And if you read, say, Shonagon's diary, you'll find that she's making fun of people who are not up to date with the latest combinations of colors and patterns for the layers of kimono. Nothing could be worse. Now, if that's not fashion, I don't know what is. In the same way, students of Mughal India and of Iran have found clear evidence that people are talking about fashion, even if often we can't quite see what they're talking about. Because in China and Japan, for example, it was much more a question of the fabrics and patterns and colors changing faster than the silhouettes. And as we'll find, this is often the case in European history too. But so just because we can't tell the difference from another culture and another perspective doesn't mean that they couldn't see, oh my God, you're wearing the kimono from 2 seasons ago. How out of it can you possibly be? Now, For complex reasons, fashion in Europe seems to have developed more fully and spread more widely, so that although it seems to have started earlier, 9th century in China and Japan versus maybe 14th, 15th century in Western Europe, by the 18th century in Europe, it had entered into a much more modern phase, developed really more fully. In European cities such as Paris, here, London, Amsterdam, it had spread well into the middle class and even into the urban working class, especially artisans who were connected with the fashion industries. And in fact, many, many aspects of today's modern fashion system already existed in 18th century Paris. So you have couturiers, you have stylists, you have shops which are trendy, you have fashion promotion, you have fashion seasons with fall and spring collections. All of those things were already in existence. You had fashion trendsetters, etc. Now, by the 19th century, you find the spread of capitalism and democracy, and fashion spreads even more widely, not just in cities, but throughout the provinces and around the world. And yet for men, you find what's been known as the great masculine renunciation, whereas all the beautiful green doublets and the jewelry and the earrings, much of that is given up in favor of a fairly drab, dark suit, although not entirely given up, because you still find men are still wearing some jewelry, and they're still wearing some color, but only in particular times and places. So this sober uniform seemed to step them out of the fashion picture, but most fashion historians now would say no, it's a more subtle type of fashion, but it still is fashion. Meanwhile, for women, goes way down the social scale. You have all kinds of mass-produced fashions which can be bought from catalogs in the provinces and at department stores in the city. So you have really a vast spread of fashion. Sometimes it's treated with pleasure. The people are saying the working man can buy his wife a dress of flowers, meaning a beautiful dress with a flowered print on it, whereas before he couldn't do that. And then you find other people who are worrying that they're no longer evident any class barriers, that you can't tell when you look on the street whether somebody is a working girl or a lady. Now, of course, that was an exaggeration. You can tell, just as you could tell back in the 60s when my dad would say, you can't tell the boys from the girls because the boys have this long hair. Of course you could tell, but it was different than it had been before. With the growth of European imperialism, Western fashions then spread all around the world, where they coexisted with, supplanted, and/or influenced local dress and fashion. So the fashions that had existed in Japan were modified under the impact of Western fashions. In some cases, as at the Meiji court, there was a directive from above that people at the court should wear Western fashion, at least on public occasions. And it was part of a really fascinating experiment where the Japanese members of the government saw that all of these countries around them were being conquered and colonized. And they said, right, we have to figure out how to fight these people on their own terms. Who has the best armies? The Prussians. Let's hire them to redo our army. Who has the best industry? The British. Let's bring them in. Who has the best fashion? Bring in French fashions for the women. Bring in English fashions for the men. Bring in Prussian uniforms for military men. Bring in everything you can to try and beat the foreign devils at their own game. Later on, by the 1920s, you had young people in the cities in Japan who were adopting Western fashion for their own pleasure. And even their mothers, who might still be wearing kimono, will be wearing it with Art Deco patterns. So again, it's a fashion system which combines elements of East and West. This is an installation shot from my current exhibition, Paris, Capital of Fashion. And it's about the rise of the haute couture, which was an important moment for making Paris, reiterating its leadership. It had been a leader in Western Europe since the late 17th century, but the development of the couture was important. Now, couture just means sewing, and there had been couturiers since the 17th century, but they were all little dressmakers, and artisans. In slave societies, dressmakers were often slaves. So they're down there sewing the hem of your skirt. Madam, what would you like, a blue dress, a yellow dress? What Worth did was transform couture from being a small-scale artisanal craft into big business, and with the claim of being high art. He said, I am an artist. I have a color sensibility like Delacroix. And at first, the French press laughed. I mean, you're not an artist. You're just a furnisher of ladies' clothes. This is a tradesman. But then they started to see competition from all of the ready-to-wear clothes being produced in New York, in Berlin, in London. And they started to see, well, maybe we could make a point of saying we're the only ones who have art fashion, couture, haute couture. At first they called it grand couture, big couture. It just meant that people like Worth had a lot of seamstresses working for them. And then they changed it to haute couture, high sewing, to indicate it was artistic and special sewing. So in that way, despite the increasing democratization of society, and particularly the democratization of men's clothing, there were still clear distinctions in place, just new sorts of distinctions and a new sort of hierarchy. Women's daytime fashions, for example, became more sober, and there were more rules about what you could wear when. But as women's daytime fashion got more sober, the underwear became correspondingly more luxurious and eroticized. And at first it was only courtesans and actresses, what Wiesmann called the aristocracy of vice, who wore all these colorful satin corsets. The respectable woman wore a white satin corset that would reflect her modesty. But these brilliantly colored corsets very rapidly became popular with fashionable women as well. And just today I was looking at some marvelous corsets in the collection of the Rijksmuseum, including a gorgeous black satin one lined in a brilliant yellow and then with yellow laces. And so again, something that was really vibrant and exciting. And Manet described the satin corset as the nude of our era. And interestingly, some cartoonists, like this one here, which is the New Temptation of St. Anthony, shows the saint is oblivious when she's naked. Ho-hum, he doesn't care. But when she starts to get dressed and pretty soon she's in all her sexy lingerie, then he's aroused because it's seen that this is making you more erotic. And indeed, there are aspects of this which we can easily understand, that complete nakedness, like on a nudist beach in Croatia, is not particularly erotic, and which is the one reason why magazines like Playboy would always put the models in high heels and with a little jewelry, because that would give them a slight personality and would then indicate this is a person here. Now, more extreme forms of physical concealment, such as veiling, were traditionally interpreted in terms of modesty. But by the late 19th century, they were increasingly sometimes perceived as erotic, or the idea of the attraction of concealment. I mean, the French colonialists became obsessed with what was under the veil, which I think forms part of the history of current French hostility to veiling. Here you see one of 40,000 photographs by the French psychiatrist Claire Rimbaud, who was a very strange figure, who worked on erotomania, sexual fetishism, and in particular, quote, the erotic passion for fabrics, very interestingly. Certain fabrics, such as silk and velvet, being in particular fetishistic. But he thought the women who stole those couldn't be fetishists because they didn't have the imagination which the male fetishist had. He also taught an art class on draping and fabric at the Art Academy. So there's all kinds of interesting, crazy thoughts going on. Today, we are inclined to interpret extreme physical veiling in political terms, either as male hegemony or in religious political terms as an example of Islamic women's resistance to Western hegemony. We might also think of it in terms of male fears about the female body, and in particular about different parts of the female body, like the hair, which have been covered up in many societies. Now I'm just going to jump ahead now to the middle of the 20th century so we can look at a few things that we're all very familiar with and see some of the range of meanings that modern fashion can have. It's different manifestations. Here from the 1950s, it's an American family. Fashion is clearly still marking socioeconomic status. It's a middle-class family. In particular, I would notice the gender distinctions that are being made especially between the adults, but also between the children. So that in the 1950s, I would argue, gender was a point of particular tension in society. It was a period when women were being pushed back in the home after World War II, and a new emphasis on more stereotypical gender roles. The period when pink started really being codified for girls and blue for boys. Now, uniforms are a special category of clothing with somewhat different role than fashion, but they're also a part of this larger fashion dress world. And here, too, we can see in the uniform of a 1950s American police woman that her role and her dress were different than those of a policeman. She's wearing a skirt, high heel shoes, a little hat, she's got a purse. I was doing research on police uniforms, and it was fascinating because one policewoman who later became a police chief talked about how they had guns, but they were in a purse, not a holster. And she said, do you know how hard it is to get a gun out of a purse when you're running after the perpetrator? But, of course, that was the point. You were not supposed to be running after the perpetrator. If you were a policewoman, you were supposed to be more of a social worker, helping lost children or something. Also, I have to laugh, it's too Freudian, the woman's gun was also 2 inches smaller than the man's gun. So it wasn't until the Equal Rights Act in the 70s that policewomen and policemen had to wear the same kind of uniforms. You also have the question of high fashion. And here also from the 50s, we have this wonderful image of fashion models. Fashion involves images as well as objects. And so it encompasses these highly stylized representations of elite women and their fashion. So this is all Dior haute couture, fashion models posing for a fashion magazine. It's a very, very stylized kind of image, which is sending an array of different messages, some easier than others to interpret, to the women reading the pages of them. And it's being presented as part of women's role or ideal to try and aspire to something like this. It's also being presented as Dior's art, that he's being a kind of artist creating this sort of beautiful object. Also 50s. Fashion at this point encompasses a number of subcultural styles, as it has already for years, because you had zoot suits prior than that, and you had sort of other styles. But here you see biker's gear, and this is again, of course, a media image from a film with Marlon Brando. But this is a style that was associated in the 50s, not only with bikers, but with certain rock and roll performers, and although most people didn't know about it, also with a subcategory of gay men. So there's a whole history of leather and that symbolism that goes together. By the post-hippie era in the 60s with the idea of youth being really an issue in fashion, you have, by this time, a young person had much more freedom than ever before, really, to fashion his or her identity according to interests and beliefs, not just socioeconomic, national, religious, marital status. This is really much more about the kind of music you like, the kind of person you are, the kind of beliefs you have. These young people chose punk fashion, punk jewelry to express, this is who I am. And by this point, the who I am is a personal identity. It's not just what we call before a social identity that your society is saying, you are this kind of woman. Instead, it's something very much chosen. Now, subcultural styles are sometimes thought of as anti-fashion, but these styles are almost immediately incorporated into the fashion system. No interesting style stays long before the fashion system gobbles it up. So, when I started fashion theory in 1997, I defined fashion as the cultural construction of the embodied identity, deliberately so I could bring in all kinds of subcultural styles, men's styles, tattoos, foot binding, everything that, hairstyles, everything that was being created with and on your body to create a particular image of yourself. In his book, Fashion, Culture, and Identity, the late sociologist Fred Davis argued that at different points in history, different issues came to the fore in fashion. Gender in the 50s, youth in the 60s, but he talked about how the ambivalences of sexuality, the dialectic of the erotic and the chaste, end quote, was always there in the background, and sometimes very much to the fore. And indeed, throughout my career, I focused very much on fashion's relation to the body, to sexuality, to gender, to eroticism, and to personal identity in a variety of ways. Yet the theoretical frameworks that have been used to study fashion have been mostly sociological. And it seemed to me that psychoanalysis provides an important, albeit controversial, complement to that. Questions of sexuality are central to Freud's work, which has had a significant influence on art and culture, and by extension on cultural theory. In addition, although Freud did not invent the idea of the unconscious, his ideas about how we can be affected by internal psychic conflicts and unconscious beliefs are widely accepted. So Marjan doesn't mention psychoanalysis. She mentions psychology briefly, but when she talks about the 6 motives for wearing jewelry, the first one that she lists is beauty and eroticism. Moreover, she argues, quote, people's need to decorate themselves is not related solely to the body. A human being has a body, and within that body is a living being with senses, emotions, fears, and desires, end quote. I think that's very crucial, and it's where psychoanalysis is potentially important. And it certainly impinges on other categories that she talks about, like power and morality, and especially desire, and also her final category, memory and emotions. So I'll just give you a few aspects of what psychoanalysis might say about fashion, and you can agree or not. Freud wrote relatively little about clothing per se, and still less about fashion, but he did discuss the sexual symbolism of particular items of clothing and materials, and subsequent generations of psychoanalysts have explored it further. This can be really reductive, but I think there is some truth behind some of these ideas of sexual symbolism, which are often based on children's fantasies, fears, and desires. And I'll just, considering the high heel shoe, it's always like phallic symbolism, right? And my students used to go, who can believe in phallic symbolism? This is ridiculous. So I'd always say, well, let me tell you 2 stories about 2 little boys who had never read Freud. Once I was taking my 4 or 5-year-old son home from the dentist, and he was a little bit loggy from all the gas that they'd given him because he had terrible teeth and they'd been working on his teeth. So we're sitting in the bus, it's twilight, it's raining, people are looking out the window, reading their newspaper, and in a loud little child's voice, he piped up, "Mom, do girls have a penis?" Everybody on the bus turned around to look at us, except, thank God, the bus driver. And they waited and stared at us. And I said, "No, honey, I thought you knew that only boys had a penis." Silence. Everyone goes back to looking out the window, reading the paper. Then he pipes up again, "Mom, do you have a penis?" The other story is not my child, but someone else's child in Washington, D.C., where a little naked 4-year-old runs into the living room with a tiny little erection saying, "Look, Mommy, look, I'm the Washington Monument." So some of these primitive ideas which are forgotten will possibly still have an unconscious memory later on. So that I think that's pretty clear that women's shoe collections are not just a closet full of phallic symbols. But I do think that for many men, high heels do seem to symbolize the common male fantasy of the phallic woman. And for gay men, you have a series of other fantasies about very well-endowed men with images of boots, etc. Psychoanalysts and psychiatrists have assured me that the #1 heterosexual male fantasy focuses on the phallic woman. And many fashion designers employ a lot of phallic imagery. Versace with all this dominatrix style, with the high heels, with the bondage gear, with the neck corset. When I worked on my book, Fetish, I met a bunch of leather fetishists, and I said to them, what do you think about the Versace look? And they said, we hate it. And I said, really, why? And they said, because for us, these clothes mean something, but these people are just using it as a fashion statement. It's not actually about the kind of sex that they want. In the same way, you see something in Helmut Newton's photography, which this sort of imagery, which is fetishistic, but also very S&M oriented, very much about kind of bondage and discipline, very ambiguous imagery of sex and power. Now, if you're writing about shoes or jewelry or lingerie or clothing and sexuality in general, I do think you have to read Freud, even if you, at the end, you conclude that his interpretation of fashion is close but no cigar. It still helps you understand aspects of the subject. So if you consider jewelry, for example, which often sparkles and catches the eye, like these diamond shoe buckles worn by elite men in 18th century England, or the diamond buttons, same for men's waistcoat. Symbols of power, status, by extension, wealth. There's an expression in English which describes the male genitals as the family jewels. And if you are in the jewelry industry, jewelry is described as hard luxury. So there's a sort of a sense that there's something here which is very sexual and attractive about jewelry. And although men still wear some jewelry, jewels have come to be popularly associated mostly with women and their bodies, and with ideas about beauty and love. And in this picture, you can see on the far side, there's a statue of Hymen, who's the goddess of marriage. He's piercing her ear with a needle, and there's an open jewel box there, and over here, it's been cut off by the side of the book, there's a large marital bed. So you have a whole series of images which are referring to heterosexual intercourse. And remember that this, of course, in the 18th century, you also had Diderot's novella, The Indiscreet Jewels, about the talking vaginas, again, long before Freud. Or this wonderful Hogarth painting, The Lady's Last Stake, which you can see the cards on the ground. They've been gambling. And you can see he's holding his hat, which is full of her jewelry. Now, she hasn't lost all of her jewelry gambling to him yet. She still has some jewels in her hair, for example. But she's wondering, should she perhaps be offering him another jewel in the way to get back the rest of her jewelry? So again, it's a sort of, they're playing with the idea that jewelry is associated with female genitals and with female sexuality. Of course, it's not the only meaning that jewelry has, any more than it's the only meaning that fashion has. But it would also be foolish to deny that jewelry and fashion have as one of its raison d'etre to adorn and beautify the wearer in a way which has some sexual connotations. These can be exaggerated, though. John Galliano, the designer who created this dress here, once said, "My goal is very simple. When a man looks at a woman wearing one of my dresses, I would like him basically to be saying to himself, I have to fuck her. I just think every woman deserves to be desired." It's a very, very crude and simplistic image of what every woman wants out of the clothing that she's buying. This idea that women's clothing says, sex, I'm all about sex. And men's clothing, the corollary always goes, I'm all about status, money. Money is my middle name, and power. If you look at psychoanalytic books, there's one on fashion and psychoanalysis by Alison Bancroft. She uses Lacan, who's pretty impenetrable, to suggest that Galliano's fashion positions women as what Lacan calls, object A, or women in his gowns as the object of desire for men. And Barbara Vinken does the same thing when she talks about a beautifully dressed woman in this kind of fashion. She appears, quote, as the fascinating, beguiling object of desire. She is his wealth, his potency, end quote. Which leaves the question open, how does she appear then to herself? Is fashion no more than an adjunct to female narcissism? There's a huge lacuna in the whole psychoanalytic field. There's no question that there's some women who do have this. I did an exhibition that I helped bring over from Paris on the Countess Grefful, and she did say that she would appear, and knowing that all the men's eyes were on her was the most powerful, fabulous feeling she could have. She was just so energized by the desire that she saw or thought was reflected in their eyes. But I don't think it's typical of what most women are interested in. Alexander McQueen's paradigm seemed rather different. If Galeano was all about the woman as man's desire, McQueen was much more about something that was very fierce and ferocious looking. McQueen said himself that he wanted to empower women. That's just a cliche. All male designers say they want to empower women. But he went on to say, more interestingly, that he wanted her to look, quote, so fabulous you wouldn't dare lay a hand on her, end quote. Which again, this idea again of the sort of fearfulness. Now think about it from the wearer's point of view. There is a sense that not just some women, but to a sense, sometimes all of us want to be armored by our clothes. That fashion can be seen as a kind of protective armored device that will make you able to withstand aggressive behavior or stares, etc. And sometimes people will wear clothes that they find lucky, etc., that will help empower them at that moment. So there is an element of that even in the ferociousness of this. Now, you can see sometimes the images of women that are used in fashion are particularly ferocious, like Versace's Medusa. And then here with the woman photographer, Madame Yvonne, who took pictures of society women in London in the 1930s, with a woman dressed as Medusa. These are obviously images of femininity which, as you could put it, subordinate women's desire to male fantasies and male fears. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't occasionally be something that would be meaningful to women as well, as fears and desires and fantasies circulate through society. So if you look at Magritte's painting, for example, Philosophy in the Boudoir, the title taken from de Sade's book, he came out of the Surrealist movement, which was deeply influenced by ideas about psychoanalysis, about the unconscious and sexuality. And these images of parts of the body pushing out through the items of dress speak directly to emotions such as fear and desire. And one book by a more recent psychiatrist, Didier Anzou, called The Skin Ego, talks about how the skin is actually the first sort of barrier but also interface between the baby and the world. It holds you in, it touches your mother's skin, the breast. It's the way you tell this is me and that's you and that's the rest of the world. And that our whole conception of ourself is related to this skin. And our clothing is very much related to what we are saying we are about ourselves. So there's a lot more in this simply than unconscious fears. Now, so in her conclusion about 6 reasons why jewelry matters, we read Marjan lists the cultural value, the historical value, the social value, the emotional value, the material value, the financial value. All good reasons and all of which apply to fashion as well. If I were to phrase it in my own terms, I would say something like this. Fashion matters because it's part of history, society, and culture, and is also an embodied expression of individual identity. Partly the designer's identity, but mostly also the wearer's identity. Of course, it's a huge global industry, but that's not the only or the most important issue. It's also a form of individual self-expression, and sometimes even a kind of art. It can embody power of many kinds, as well as desire and memory. Sometimes people say to me, I don't care about fashion at all. Fashion doesn't matter to me. And I always go, really? Does your mom buy your clothes for you? And they're always horrified. Of course not. Of course they buy their own clothes. Because they wouldn't delegate the creation of their own persona to another person. It is very important. And as we consider why fashion matters, I wanted to end with a quote from the science fiction writer J.G. Ballard, who's probably most famous for his memoir, Empire of the Sun. He once defined fashion as, quote, a recognition that nature has endowed us with one skin too few. Thank you very much.